Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Welcome, everybody. Is that door closed? So we are just getting into the 8th chapter of the Gita. And Krishna, he says, it's a kind of a well-known verse. Yam yam vapi smaran bhavam tyajati ante kalevaram tam te me vaite kaunteya sada tadbhava bhavitaha. Whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, that state they will attain without fail. So this is kind of a well-known, standard idea in Hindu circles. I think really in Eastern spiritual circles, this idea that what you're thinking about when you die is going to determine what happens to you after death. I think largely like Occidental religion doesn't really go for this. I don't recall hearing anything corollary to this. I don't recall hearing anything corollary to this in either Judaism or Christianity or Islam. I mean, there are peculiar things in those traditions as well. You know, there's this like antinomian ideal that you can do anything you want to do, but if you've accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, that's it. Like you can go and get baptized and that's it, you're done. Just go back to whatever you were doing, it doesn't really matter. And so that idea would be very peculiar. Even within some sects of Christianity, but what to speak of if you were to look at like an Eastern tradition. It would seem very peculiar at the outset. I don't know that it holds up well if you do a deep dive either. You know, you could explain, well, you know, there's two types of ways of looking at a spiritual tradition. You can look at their orthodoxy, their proper belief, and you can look at their orthopraxy, their proper practice. And so in the early days of Christianity, there was a big focus on your practice. But as the centuries rolled on, Christianity eventually began to focus more on what your beliefs were. And so then what your practice was became less significant until eventually it was just what you believed. And if you believed the right thing, then that was enough. And that mixed together with this theory of self, that the soul was fundamentally fractured and broken, that can be traced back to Augustine, that Adam and Eve messed up, and that everybody since then participates in the same broken natures, Adam and Eve, who broke their original covenant with the deity. And everybody from that point forward has a fundamentally flawed nature. And so sin is endemic and almost intrinsic to the human condition, to the beastly condition of human beings. So there's no real hope of building a stairway to heaven or going back just by your works alone. And so this vicarious atonement and redemption, redeeming of the soul, buying back of the soul by Jesus, called ransom theory. That became a necessity, which was grace. And then some people started thinking, well, we're so broken, and it's all based on grace. And they got into this what's called monergism. It's just by the grace of God, because you can't do anything. And so then this tradition where it was mainly your practice became mainly your belief, and eventually became almost offensive to think your practice had anything to do with it, which led people to just assume that they were committing sin the moment they left the church, so they had to go back for regular confessions, and then that created a door for people to slide in and think they could get away with doing almost anything provided they regularly confessed. And then that eventually became, if you just got baptized, that was enough. So if we trace out the origin of that idea, it doesn't look any better. It looks like the degradation of a tradition. Do you guys follow that? So you get these weird ideas, or you get the weird idea that you're eating the body and blood of Christ. And that he's the Lamb of God, he's the Paschal Lamb, the Passover Lamb, and that you're ritually consuming his body. And so when you eat the wafer and the grape juice, that's really meant to symbolize the eating of Jesus, who himself became the sacrificial lamb for the pleasure of the deity, which then saved us from our mistakes, the same way that the Passover was held to extirpate the sins and create forgiveness for the Jewish people. It doesn't, you get into it, you figure out where it came from and how it evolved. It doesn't sound any better. Right? So sometimes you catch an idea, and then just on the surface the idea seems a little weird. I think this idea that whatever state of being you remember when you give up your body, then that's the state you'll go to. That's the state that you're going to attain. I think that idea just right on the surface, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because you end up with a deity that's cheap. And it's like a "what have you done for me lately" deity. And if you don't remember the right thing at the right time, then you're in trouble. And Krishna becomes quite exacting and really harsh, and definitely not all good. I mean, would an all good deity just judge you by what you remember at the last moment? Would you get no credit for anything you've ever done before? No, right? You might make the argument the other way, that an all-good deity would remember what you've done, and then if you didn't do anything and just at the last minute you did something, then you get credit for that. You could say that would work, potentially. Of course, then you get the trouble where that might be an all-good deity, but it wouldn't necessarily be an all-fair deity. And you got to try to walk that fine line between all good and all fair. And favoritism and arbitrary standards start to erode away at the justice of the deity. And so now you got a whole nother can of worms that you got to contend with. Now, if you just remember at the end, but you don't live a life of devotion, and that's enough, right? Then how does that honor the lifelong commitment people have made? And how does that encourage people to live a pious life? Certainly an all-good deity would promote normative behavior. And this doesn't promote normative. It promotes like you buy some kind of like a earpiece. And then when your heart stops, it triggers the earpiece. It screams Krishna in your ear. And then you die, you know? You follow? Also, it could easily be seen, and this is the path that the negative utilitarians, utilitarianism is essentially the idea that the ends justifies the means, so you want to get a good result. And then there's two primary versions of it, hedonic and negative. So one is you want to increase pleasure, and that can be either personal or public. Increase my own personal pleasure or the pleasure of everyone. And then negative has two flavors too. Decrease my pain or decrease the pain of everybody. If the purpose of life was to decrease the pain of yourself or of everybody, you could tell everyone, think of Krishna, and then shoot them. You follow? Do you follow? If the purpose of life was to decrease pain, and that's all you're supposed to do, and then if you remember Krishna, you go back to heaven. So obviously you wouldn't suffer unnecessarily. Then you could argue that the proper way to respond to that reality would then be to everybody think of Krishna, because we can control that. We can all think of Krishna, and then somebody would gas us or shoot us or whatever. And that would ensure that we went to heaven, because all you have to do is think of Krishna when you die, and therefore the purpose of life is to die at the right moment. You see all the problems you run into? So this, on the surface, just prima facie, it appears to suffer similar types of flaws as you find in these various bizarre tenets of world religions that we're really familiar with, like cannibalizing Christ, and then and also antinomianism. You can get away with anything if you believe the right thing. You guys follow me? So I think the next verse is worth looking at. Tasmat sarveshu kaleshu. Therefore, in all circumstances, in all times, mam anusmara yudhyacha. Think of me and fight. Mai arpita manobud here. Place your mind and intellect in me. Think of me. Mam evaisyasi asangshaya. And you'll come to me without any doubt. Now that's an interesting verse to tag on the back end of this statement. So I read this, whatever you remember when you quit your body, that's where you go, right? And that's the follow-up verse to whoever at the end of his life quits his body remembering me alone attains my nature. So Krishna says, if you think of me, then you go back to heaven, because whatever you think of, that you attain. So it's a specific idea, and then the general principle behind that specific idea. If you think of me, you'll go to me, because whatever you think of, there you'll go. This, I think, naturally leads to all these questions like I just asked. At least for me it does. And in the next verse, Krishna says, therefore, you should always think of me in the form of Krishna. That's Prabhupada's little addition. And at the same time, carry out your prescribed duty of fighting. With your activities dedicated to me and your mind and intelligence fixed on me, you will attain me without doubt. It's a pretty straight translation. Prabhupada mentions in the form of Krishna. Krishna says, think of me, so it's pretty clear he means me. And so Prabhupada just adds to it so you won't get some impersonal idea. And then carry out your prescribed duty of fighting. Well, most of us don't have fighting as our prescribed duty, so that broadening of the instruction to mean do your duty, which in Arjuna's case was fighting, but we generalize that to do your duty because you might not be that your dharma is to fight. You guys all following this? So that to me seems to be a bit of a red herring. It doesn't fit with all the questions that I got from reading what Krishna said. You follow? Tadeo, you want to comment?
No, Prabhu, I think you problematize it quite nicely, and I'm eager to hear your resolution.
Well, I problematized it, and then I read what Krishna said, which doesn't seem to be relevant at all to my line of thinking. You follow? Like if Kat's like, bring me a glass of something, and I'm like, okay, he's asking for a glass of something, that means I can bring him a glass of gasoline, or I can bring him a glass of poison. And so like, potentially like he's opening himself up to like all sorts of problems, right? And so like, there's something wrong with that statement. Bring me a glass of something. And then the next sentence is, so of course bring me a glass of water. It doesn't fit with, the initial verse had a bunch of problems with it, but the following verse seems to like have a whole different mindset behind it. Are you guys following this? So I problematized the verse, and then I problematized my problematization. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers and put them in the pot and pickled them. So I saw some potential defects in the verse, but then Krishna doesn't seem to be on the same track at all. He seems to be going in a totally different direction. I think it's important to understand that the way we view the world isn't necessarily how other traditions view the world. And so somehow out of the statement that whatever you remember, you will become, therefore at all times and all circumstances you should remember me, I don't do that math. My math doesn't work like that. I start to think of all sorts of ways to escape, and you can get something for nothing, almost like a con game. Like you know what I mean? It's like some kind of loophole. Like a double, triple coupon, and they end up owing you money. You buy a TV, and they end up owing you $50 with your quadruple, quintuple coupons, across multiple newspapers. You follow? And so Krishna seems to be taking it just in a totally different way. And so, sometimes you look at something and you have a particular way of viewing the world, and so you notice features of a statement, or you go down a certain road. But the other party might not be going down that road at all. You might have missed it. I had a friend, some Mexican devotee, we were hanging out, and how come he's not just devotee? Because he spoke Mexican, that's why. Because he spoke the old Mexican. This Mexican devotee was hanging out with us, and he was a young priest, and this devotee I was with was an older priest. And that devotee was leaving to go to the temple. We were in an ashram across the street from the temple, so he was leaving to go to the temple. And this Mexican devotee said, "See you soon. See you soon." So the two of us were walking out the door, and he said, "See you soon." So I was like, "Oh, hasta luego, see you later." Like, no problem. But then the devotee I was with lost it and goes, "Oh, see you soon? Because I go to the temple for a few minutes and come back? You trying to say I'm supposed to stay in the temple for class? I've been a devotee for as long as you've been alive, and who do you think you are to judge me just because I don't go to the temple for the full program?" You follow? And he lost it on him. And this poor Spanish-speaking devotee said, "Oh, I hear you guys say that to each other. I'm trying to learn English, so I said it too." And then my friend, who was smart, just immediately looked like, because obviously it was his issue. And so he read into an innocent statement by somebody else, something that just simply wasn't there. He projected onto somebody else his own guilt about not spending enough time at the temple. That's the term for it. It's projection. So people do this. They create a whole narrative in their head that may have nothing to do with the person that they're dealing with. I think we have a case of that here. Krishna said, if you think of me, you'll come to me. Because whatever, when you die, what you're thinking of is what will happen to you. And then the unstated premise that's not here is that, and whatever you spend your life doing is what you'll think of when you die. You follow? That's an unstated premise. How do we know it's an unstated premise? Because of the statement that comes just now, therefore you should always think of me in all circumstances. In other words, that's the math Krishna did. So, if you remember me, you'll come to me. Because whatever you think of when you die is what happens to you. And of course, whatever you think of when you die is what you think of during your life. And therefore, at all times, you should think of me. You see it? And so sometimes another tradition will look at, something. Somebody from another school of thought or another language will look at something. Like let's say you're learning Spanish. And you find out that they have this whole tú and usted thing going on, where you can talk to somebody informally, ¿Cómo estás? And it's like, how are you, bro? The verb estás is used in a familiar sense, and it indicates intimacy and also a lack of formality. And then, if you want to talk to somebody respectfully, well, if you want to just talk to somebody you don't know, like if you know somebody, hey, ¿cómo estás? What's going on? What's going on? It's kind of what that means. It literally means, how are you? But because of the conjugation of the verb, estar, as estás, it comes off as, how's it going? Right? But then if you say, ¿cómo está? That's more like you don't know the person, and you're not trying to be their friend, and you're just like talking to them. But if you want to be really respectful, you'll be like, ¿cómo está usted? And you'll throw in the honorific usted in there. And then it becomes like really formal. So you can create distance, you can create formality and respect, you can create intimacy. Is that accurate? It's accurate, right? And so you can do all that in that language, in Spanish. So somebody could learn Spanish and just learn basic conjugation of the first verb you learn, which is the verb estar, the infinitive estar, to be, and it becomes he is, she is, they are, they will be, they were, I am. All those all those are conjugations of this verb. It's the first thing you learn. And you could come back and you could be like, wow, Latin American culture, or Spanish-speaking culture, really, or even Romance languages in general, potentially, they have a real hierarchy within them, and like a number of nuances that aren't so readily available in English. They take their verbs and they can create intimacy just by the way they use their verbs, or formality, and it's actually part of the language and the grammar. It's not just slang or informal usage, but it's a formalized thing. It's part of their formal grammar. And that teaches you something about the people who speak that language, because they came up with words which indicate something. They tell you something about the way they view the world. You follow? So that's you're an outsider and you're looking in. And if you don't project, your position as an outsider can actually give you some insight. If you project, you end up assuming they're like you, and you might misunderstand them. And I think it's the case here. Krishna says, think of me, you'll come to me. Or alternatively, or he says, because the general rule is whatever you think of, that's what happens to you. And then the result of that is you're like, well, I could get away with anything. And just think of Krishna at the end. And Krishna responds and goes, yeah, and so because you understand this general principle, that whatever you spend your life doing is what you'll think of at the end, which is what will happen to you. Therefore, you should always think of me. And I already told you to do your duty, so obviously you have to still do that, but you have to think of me while doing your duty. And so this whole problematization I did was because of a mindset I brought to the verse and a way I interpreted the verse, which from the surrounding texts is clearly not what Krishna was intending to communicate. You follow this? And so this kind of stuff happens. You fit a square peg into a round hole, you have a particular worldview, and then you force other things into that worldview that don't fit. Sometimes, if you don't project, your outsider's perspective gives you a unique insight into what's really going on, because you don't do the group think. And you can notice what's happening because you're aloof enough from what's happening that you can see the moves going on. You see that? So it can actually work to your favor. Did you guys follow all that? I thought that was really fascinating. I don't know about you guys, but I thought that was pretty cool. I think we did a good job of looking at our own cultural conditioning and the culture of another tradition, and how to interface appropriately, and where it can give insight, and where it can also lead to miscommunication. I thought we really got somewhere there. What about you? Yeah. It was good, right? Okay. All right. All right, now that we're warmed up, the train has left the station. He who meditates on me as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his mind constantly engaged in remembering me, undeviated from the path, he is sure to reach me. Well, this seems pretty darn repetitive, doesn't it? Let me read it again. Listen carefully. He who meditates upon me as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his mind constantly engaged in remembering me, undeviated from the path, he's sure to reach me. The last verse said, if you remember me and do your duty, then you'll come to me without a doubt. I think this verse sounds pretty redundant. How about you guys? Yes. All right, good. Let's look at the Sanskrit a little more carefully. Abhyasa yoga yuktena. Someone whose mind, actually the mind isn't there. Someone who is yoked to me through the yoga of practice. Yuktena means by being yogad to me with abhyas yoga. Yoga means union and or method, and abhyas means practice. Actually, the term comes up in the Yoga Sutras. Abhyas and vairagya, practice and renunciation, are what lead to samadhi in the Yoga Sutras. And so by the practice of yoga, by being yoked to the practice of yoga. Cetasa, by the mind being yoked to the practice of yoga. Nanyagamina, and undeviatingly, without any other objective. Paramam Purusham Divyam Anuchintayan Yati. one achieves the supreme transcendental being by always thinking of that being. Now notice Krishna doesn't say, think of me, anywhere in the verse. He actually speaks in the third person. You guys follow that? And so he says, by being yoked to the practice of yoga with your mind not going anywhere else, one achieves a supreme transcendental being by constantly thinking of that being. Did you guys follow that? So that's still quite similar, isn't it? But it's a little different now, more so, because it's not me anymore. Although it is me, but Krishna's speaking himself in the third person. You need to obey me and do what I say, because you have to always listen to your father. I'm saying the same thing, but it's not merely repetitive. I'm arguing something, right? Also, this Paramam Purusham Divyam, the supreme transcendent being, that starts to get into the language of the Purusha. In the Vedas, God was called the Purusha, the being. Purush means male. If you go to an Indian bathroom and it says, men's, it'll say Purush. It means male. It also means person. Just like the word mankind can refer to women and men. And it also means God, who is the supreme original being. Nityo Nityanam Chaitanas Chaitananam. He's the one eternal amongst eternals and the one conscious one amongst conscious beings. The original. You follow? So, Krishna now here adjusts things. He's speaking in the third person. That switches things up a little bit. You focused? You sure? You look a little spacey. And you look it. Keep it together, dude. Focus. We're almost done. All right. So, Krishna's speaking in the third person. That does change things a little bit. Just like if I say, listen to me, listen to your father. It's not exactly the same. It's identifying a role I play and therefore why it's actually an explanation of why you should listen to me. You follow? But it also starts to use the language of the older Vedic tradition. And you remember how at the beginning of the chapter we also found a number of words. Adi Daiva, Adi Bhuta, Adi Yagya, Adhyatma, Brahman. These are words from the old Veda. And Krishna's using that language. And so, in a lot of ways, this 8th chapter is Krishna surveying the old Upanishads and bringing them into a dialogue with what he's trying to communicate by showing you that what he's saying is really what's there in the original Upanishads. And so by bringing up the Supreme Transcendent Being, now all of a sudden, you having fun there? Now all of a sudden, he's opened a door for us to more in earnest discuss the Upanishads. And the next verse. Kavim Pudana Manushashitaram Anoraniyangsam Anusmadedyaha Savasyadatadam Achintya Rupam Adityavarnam Tamasa Parastat. One should meditate on the Supreme Person as the one who knows everything, as the one who's the oldest, who is the controller, who's smaller than the smallest, who's the maintainer of everything, who's beyond all material conception, who's inconceivable, and who's always a person. He's luminous like the sun, and he's transcendental beyond this material nature. This verse is a mashup of at least 3 verses from the Upanishads. It tells you how to meditate on divinity. The Supreme Being is Kavi. Kavi means the one who knows. It's used in a variety of contexts in Sanskrit to refer to a poet, a sage, a doctor, a dramaturgy expert, a linguistic expert, but especially it's used to indicate a poet, at least nowadays. Previously it was used much more to indicate like a learned person. Now it has very much the concept of a poet. My son's name is Kavi Karnapur. Karnapur means the earring of the poets, meaning that poets hear poetry and they speak poetry that other people hear. And so the earring of the poet is like the one who beautifies the ears of those who listen to them, be they the audience or other poets. And amongst poets, he's the earring, the ornament of the ear amongst poets, because what he speaks is so melodious and beautiful and deep. Then it's like all poets try to enter into your ears, but this person's speech is beautiful. It adorns your ears. His poetry adorns your ears. That's what Kavi Karnapur means. The name of my son. So Kavi Karnapur is a saint from our tradition 5 centuries ago, who wrote some very, very important texts in our tradition. And so that's literally what the name means, but it also refers to this individual. So Krishna is Kavi. He's in knowledge. And he's Puran. He's old. He's the oldest. And he's Anushashitaram. He controls others. The word Shastra for scripture is from shush, which means to control. And so scriptures are those texts which control human society because they tell you what to do. Anor Aniyangsam. He is smaller than the smallest. That's an unusual one, isn't it? We normally say God is greater than the greatest, but here it says he's smaller than the smallest. So there's an alpha omega thing going on. He's A to Z. But there's also the idea that being smaller than the smallest means you're in everything. You can permeate everything. It's also an opulence. It's also an opulence. Anusmaradyaha. One should think of the Lord like this. One should think of the Lord like this. One must think of the Lord like this. Must remember the Lord like this. So we're told to remember Krishna, and now we're given some ideas about how to actually remember the Supreme Being. And Krishna doesn't just quote something new. He doesn't say something. He goes back to the Upanishads, which have already laid out how to meditate on the Supreme Divine Being. And now he's saying, you should be meditating on me, and that's because you should be meditating on God, ergo I am God. And here are the verses about what it means to meditate on me. You following this? There's a flow to it, isn't it? If you remember me, you'll come to me. Because whatever you remember, you'll go to. Unstated premise. And whatever you spend your life doing is what you'll meditate on. Therefore, always think of me. Think of your Father. And here are the ancient verses which tell you how to do it. See how nicely it flows? Sarvasya Dataram. So he's smaller than the smallest, but what's he doing? He's maintaining everything. The word Vishnu means one who enters into everything. But we usually translate Vishnu the maintainer because of this idea. If you're smaller than the smallest, then you enter into everything, and therefore you are the principle that everything exists on, and therefore you're actually maintaining everything. Very similar to how we look at physics. The principles of physics permeate everything. There are these tiny microscopic quantum principles, but the whole universe is ultimately dependent on them, and it builds the entire universe. Did you follow this? So something which is smaller than the smallest permeates everything and is therefore all-pervasive and is therefore maintaining everything. Therefore, Krishna is smaller than the smallest, and he's maintaining everything. And so Vishnu literally means the one who enters into things through Vish. But we always translate as the maintainer. Prabhupada put up real warm because it's super cold. Like just wrap the other chadar around him, like thoroughly. Both chadars, the one is on him already, and just put the other one all the way around his whole body. So we usually translate Vishnu as the maintainer. Have you ever seen that? Vishnu the maintainer? That's based on the same principle, because he enters into everything, because he's the finest, because he's all-pervasive, and therefore he enters into everything, and therefore he maintains everything, because he's the ultimate principle of all existence, the substratum of all that exists. As Christian philosophers started saying a couple hundred years ago, he's the ground of being, the very ground upon which being rests. Beingness of everything that exists rests on this ground, is built on this ground. Which of course leads you to go, well, then how could hell ever be separated from God, fundamentally? How could the devil ever be separated from God, fundamentally, if he's really the ground of being? And so it leads to these kind of questions. So anyway, that's how that flows. So we might not have caught that, but there's actually a logic. There's a way that a group of people looked at the world, which is in many ways very different than the way we look at the world. You follow? But there's something to it. They got something going on. Achintya rupam. He has a form which is inconceivable. He has a form, and that form goes beyond what you can possibly think of. So you're supposed to think, anuchintayan. Chint means to think, but here it says achintya. You can't, it's beyond you. So we're told to think of it, but in the next verse we're being told that the form goes beyond what you will be able to capture with your mind. It's far out, right? The juxtapositioning of language. You should think of him in this way. Actually, his form is inconceivable. But it's being described, but it's inconceivable. Aditya Varnam, it's luminous like the sun. Tamasa parastat, beyond the darkness. It's a famous verse. Matamasa, not the light, not the dark. Don't go to the darkness. Jyotirgamaya, go to the light. It's an old Vedic verse, ancient Sanskrit verse. Don't go to the darkness, go to the light. So he's beyond the darkness, and he's luminous like the sun. One who at the time of death fixes his life air between his eyebrows, and by the strength of yoga, with an undeviating mind, engages himself in remembering the Supreme in full devotion, will certainly attain to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That's a little like worse. Previously it was like, just think of me, do your duty. Now we're told, prayana kale, at the time of death, manasa achalena, with an undeviating mind, bhaktya yukto, yoked with bhakti, yoga balena, with the power of yoga, bruvor madhye pranam avesha, with your prana entered between your eyebrows. So you focused your consciousness inward. Satam param purusham upaiti divyam. If you do that, then you'll attain the Supreme Person. Back to the previous verse. This Supreme Being that we just described, you'll attain him if you do all this. But before you just said, all you have to do is remember me and do your duty. Now he's got this whole other thing going on. And I think what's important to note is that these types of ideas about how to ritually create a stairway to heaven and remember God ritually and progressively are very much what the Upanishads are about. And so this language here, again, is very much from the Upanishads, about how one can focus on remembering God. However, it's a lot more rigorous than we might have initially thought when we thought, oh, it's just a cheap thing, you just remember. If somebody thinks that thinking is actually the most difficult thing, and to rectify your mindset is the most difficult thing, then to say what you think of, like that might be the scariest thing. Like, how do I always think of Krishna? You follow? We think, oh, that's so cheap. But maybe we don't understand what they mean when they say thinking of Krishna. They seem to mean undeviating and so on and so forth. Let's see what else they have to say about this. Persons who are learned in the Vedas, who utter Omkar, who are great sages in the renounced order. Omkar just means Om. Kar means like the syllable Om. Who are great sages in the renounced order, they enter into Brahman. Desiring such perfection, one practices celibacy. I shall now briefly explain to you the process by which one may attain salvation. All right, so now it's clear. Persons who are learned in the Vedas, who utter Om, who are great sages, sannyasis it says, they enter Brahman, desiring such perfection, desiring liberation. They are mumukshabhi. They are yat ichanta. They are desiring this. And they brahmacharya charanti. They practice brahmacharya. They practice celibacy. I shall now briefly explain to you the process by which one may attain salvation. Well, I think at this point, we might as well bring something up that I was thinking about. Tomorrow, one of our devotees is getting married. She's been celibate for 7 years. Completely, without a single fall down. 7 years of sobriety. She's super pretty. She's super smart. She's ridiculously successful. I'm fairly certain if she got herself a Hinge account, she'd have like 50 dates in one night. And so she chose to be celibate in 2014 or 15 in Califas, in Southern California. She's from Buena Park. She was in a sorority. She went to Cal State University of Long Beach. Just a regular Southern California girl. And somehow or other, she managed to follow the life of a monk for 7 years. Most people would say, like, it's not possible. And you'd be like, well, there's this Indian guy who did it. And you'd be like, yeah, but he's from India. I'm from Southern California. You know? Of course, Southern California is not the roughest place around. You go to Brazil, and you're like, oh, man, Southern California was chill. Like, Brazil is way worse. Like, there are more sensual places on the planet than Southern California. Miami is one of them. But, I mean, this is like no small feat. No small feat. Like, it's like impressive. This is the old system. It's not like we made this up. Interestingly, brahmacharya means activity of Brahman, literally. But it doesn't. Like, yeah, dude, get it together. So, brahmacharya literally means activity of Brahman. But it doesn't actually mean that. It means celibacy. Sometimes a word literally means something, but it, like for instance, if you say, let's make a Xerox. The Xerox company does more than just make copy machines. They make all sorts of electronic equipment. But if you say, let me get a Xerox, why are you running away?
Oh, the floor is really cold, so I was going to sit on a cushion.
So bring the cushion here and sit here.
I just didn't want to have to cause heart attack.
Okay, so you did that.
I
And,
just figured I'd stay there, sit on a cushion.
all right, yeah. It didn't happen. You caused more of a disturbance. If you say, let's get a Xerox. It means let's get a copy. It doesn't even mean from a Xerox. It can be from any copy machine. Nobody goes, oh, wait a second, that's a Kodak. I don't want a copy from a Kodak. I don't want a copy from a Xerox machine. Nobody says that. So Xerox means copy, but the word Xerox is the name of a company that makes a lot more than just copy machines. But somehow or other, that's just the way it came. That's just the way it happened. You follow? So brahmacharya literally does mean activity of Brahman. And sometimes cheesy yogis who don't practice brahmacharya say, oh, it just means being spiritual. But it doesn't mean that. If you look at old Sanskrit literature and old Sanskrit dictionaries that tell you what words mean that were written thousands of years ago, brahmacharya always means celibacy. So again, this is like you have to know the language and know the culture to be able to understand what's being stated, because even a literal book definition, like if Google translated it, they wouldn't get it right. So we've been told, hey, just think of me and you'll come to me, because whatever you think of is where you go. Oh, I can cheat the system. No, because whatever you give your life to, that's what you'll think of, and therefore do your duty and think of me. And then you'll attain the Supreme Being, which is me. And here's some old verse about how to meditate on the Supreme Being. And now when we're talking about what it means to think of the Supreme Being, it's not cheap like what you think it means. There's actually a whole lifestyle of focusing the consciousness, of being celibate, of chanting, of living a life of renunciation, desiring liberation above all other things, such that you have a big enough yes in your life that you can proceed towards that and not get caught in the weeds. You follow? There's a whole tradition. So Krishna's introducing us to the Upanishadic way of understanding things. The yogic situation is that detachment from all sensual engagements, closing all the doors of the senses, and fixing the mind on the heart and the life air at the top of the head. One establishes himself in yoga. You close the gates of the body through mudras and bandhas. You focus the consciousness. After being situated in this yoga practice and vibrating the sacred syllable Om, the supreme combination of letters, if one thinks of the Supreme Personality of God and quits his body, he will certainly reach the spiritual planets. So it's no joke, right? It's a big deal. That thinking of me when you die means you have to really change the way you live. You follow? Now this verse comes. And for me, this verse is it represents a change in the language of the Upanishads. Because what I have right now is Krishna made it seem relatively easy. He said, think of me and you'll come to me. Do your duty and fight. It sounded fairly straightforward and simple. And now he's gone and he's complicated the whole thing. It's become quite convoluted. You got to chant Om. You got to be celibate. You have to be a renunciate. You have to close off all the gates of your body through mudras and bandhas. You have to place the mind in the heart, focus consciousness in between the eyebrows on the strength of yoga while chanting Om. You have to leave your body. And if you do that and remember God in this very intricate way, then you'll achieve perfection. It no longer sounds like a simple thing. It sounds pretty elaborate, pretty complex, and this whole remembering God thing is now a much bigger endeavor. And it almost seems like Krishna kind of pulled a fast one. He said, remember me, and then he kind of switched the whole thing up on you. You follow? See how I'm reading it? See where I'm at with it? Yeah? Okay. And now, there's this verse. For one who always remembers me without deviation, I'm easy to obtain because of his constant engagement in devotional service. Ananya cheta satatam yo mam smarati nityasa. One who always remembers me, always, without deviation. Tasyaham sulabha partha. For him, I am easy to achieve. And so what it seems to me that Krishna's done here is he's streamlined the Upanishadic process. And it's not this esoteric absolute being who's very, very far removed. It's Krishna. It's like somebody you can actually conceive of. And this process of remembering isn't this very, very elaborate process that you have to go through. It's quite simple. If you just remember Krishna, that's the critical feature of the other process. You have to do all these things and remember Krishna. Or you can just remember Krishna. And that's why you should just do your duty and remember Krishna. And you don't have to do all of this. You can just do your duty and remember Krishna, which is what he said. So in a lot of ways, Krishna is comparing and contrasting the spirituality he is advocating here, and he's comparing and contrasting it to the older tradition. And the version he's giving us is a much more streamlined, essentialized version that's not lacking in any of the potency. And you can appreciate Krishna's magnanimity when you look at the larger tradition that he's commentating on, because you can see how he's really simplifying things and making it easy. And as an example of that, most people, they come to our movement for a minute and then they split. We're too austere. We're cool, so if they come and hang out with us, they become cool for a minute, but at a certain point, they go out and foray out into the world, and then Prabhupada said they thought they were going to make a big splash, but they make a little bloop. And that's why the word bloop, he tried to make the sound of like a little stone going into the water. And so then devotees called falling from our tradition, they called it blooping. You don't hear it anymore. We used to call people who didn't shave their heads and chant 16 rounds fringies, because they were on the fringe. That's also not used anymore. And then people who left and actually fell down and did whatever people who fall down do, we called them, we said that they blooped. And so most people come for a minute, they bask in the light of the Devotees Association, they follow, they think they got it all figured out. They go back out in the material world, make a big splash, they make a little bloop, and then Puna Mushiko Bhava, they again become a mouse. You guys know that story? There was a mouse, came to a sage, said, "The cat's chasing me, help me." And the sage said, "What do you want?" He goes, "Make me a dog." He said, "Okay, become a dog." Then the dog ran off, super happy, ruff, ruff. Then the dog came back later on. And said, what's the matter? The dog said, "Tiger's chasing me." Or no, he said, what's chasing him? Something big. A jackal's chasing me. And they said, "Well, what do you want?" He goes, "Make me a tiger." So they made him a tiger. And then the tiger started looking at the sage and licking his chops, like he was going to eat the sage. And the sage said, "Puna Mushiko Bhava." Again, mouse become. And then the mouse who became a dog, who became a tiger, again became a mouse and scurried off. So we do that sometimes. We think we're rising up, and then we get too big for our britches. And then like a balloon, we pop, and we again become a mouse. And we fall back into the material tabernacle. And we lose what didn't really belong to us. We were borrowing it. We thought we owned it, but we didn't. And then we lost it. That happens for most people. They don't make it. Out of so many people who come, dozens, one of them makes it as far as you've made it. A clean spiritual life, over half a decade of strictly following the regular principles, and you got engaged, and you're getting married tomorrow, and you never fell down, never fell away. Who does that in 2021? Maybe like the Amish, maybe. Probably not. They all get messed up. Like the Hasidim, they have all sorts of things they do on the sly. Who does this anymore? Nobody does this. And so you made it. Clean run. And so the deities want you to get married in front of them. You got like beautiful temple. We renovated the whole building for you. And the place is looking great. And it's the eve of your wedding, and there's this like the biggest, most beautiful mandap we've ever built. And the deity's gonna be dressed gorgeously in incredible garlands. You got like the greatest outfit ever made, like my wife's like greatest masterpiece she made for you. And everything's ready. It all happened. You did the right thing. We have it easy. It used to be the first thing you had to do to become a yogi was you had to be celibate. That was like a lifetime commitment that you had to observe before you could be admitted into a path of yoga. That's why it's part of the yamas and niyamas. It's not even there in the asana practice, what you have to do before you even get to the asana practice. That used to be the way it rolled. Women didn't even do this. Women were out because they had to have families, so they couldn't do this. And like most men were out too. It was just like the ones who wanted to become lifelong monks, like the Catholic Church. But we have here a system that actually works. You can get married, you can have a family, you can enjoy the material world in a pious way. It's austere, but it's like austere compared to what? Compared to the Upanishads, it's not austere at all. Compared to the way most people live in California del Sur, yeah, it might be a little more austere than like what most people are getting, But compared to the world of the Vedas, what Krishna's recommending here, where you can be married, where you can do your duty, where you can have a job, where you can fight, where you can perform your obligations, where you can take care of your family, where you can have a family, where you can enjoy the material world, where you can earn, where you can do what you were put on this earth to do, and you don't have to turn away from everything and live the life of a renunciate, of an ascetic. That's way more doable. It's still high. It's still auspicious. It's still the road less traveled. But it's not impossible. With a little bit of luck, Donald Trump wished Biden luck in his farewell speech. I wish him a lot of luck. You need luck. It's like a leprechaun or something, I don't know. Like revealing his like swarup as a leprechaun. And so he's telling him he needs luck, We need some luck. We need some grace. We need some help. We need some like shelter. But it's possible. How do we know it's possible? Because you just did it. I was just talking to your Guru Maharaj today. And I was telling them exactly what you did, that you never fell off the altar, that you never gave up your service, that you followed strictly from day one. And he was like thrilled. And he's coming to your wedding. Virtually, but he's going to be there. So anyway, as I read these verses, they're topical. They're relevant. They speak to us even now. That we need to stay the course. We need to be good. We need to do the right thing. It's austere. It's difficult, no doubt. But it's not that austere. It's not that bad. It's actually kind of cool. When QAnon bit the dust a couple days ago, they were expecting that the military that was there to protect Biden was going to turn on Biden. And they were going to have public executions. And Trump was going to somehow uphold the Constitution by subverting the rule of law and doing a military coup. And then when it didn't happen, like in real time, they were like on their, 8chan and on their different message boards. And when it didn't happen, people started losing it. Like nothing's happening. Because like it was a millenarian cult, and so they had this like end of times. They had this, apocalypse that they prophesized, and it didn't happen. And it's really rough, And they're like, I'm so disappointed, and I have to take a break. And but one of the guys said, hey, at least we had like a lot of fun together the last few years. And so even though Krishna consciousness is difficult, it's a lot of fun. You think it's difficult, go live on the outside for a minute. Go back to WeHo. People, what's going on up there? People are suffering. People suffer a lot. We embrace the disease as if it's the cure. We are not smart enough to do the math and realize the thing we're holding on to is actually the disease. And so letting go of what you're attached to is painful. But it's not nearly as painful as holding on. We're pretty strict. We're not kidding around, but we want to think of Krishna. We want to remember Krishna. It's no joke. And so we got to perform some austerities. They're tough, but they're not impossible. You can do it. We can do it. And here's Krishna encouraging us, saying, hey, I got this hack. You can just remember me. It's actually there in the older tradition. It says you have to remember me, but it says all this other stuff you have to do, but I've simplified it. You just have to remember me all the time. And so we still have some principles we follow to allow that remembrance of Krishna all the time to happen, but it's nowhere near as difficult as it could be. You know, when Prabhupada first came here, he initiated devotees without telling them what the four regs were. Then he told them what the four regular principles were after they were initiated. He printed on a mimeograph sheet and just posted it after he initiated people a few days later. People were like losing their minds. But then he told people, they asked like, how many rounds should we chant? And so Prabhupada said 64 rounds. Because that's the standard. It's 100,000 names a day. It's called, you're a lakshapati. You're the master of 100,000. Because you chant 100,000 names of Krishna every day, which is 64 rounds. And the devotees were just losing it. They couldn't cope. It was on a walk. And so Prabhupada said, okay, 32. And they were still like, oh no. Prabhupada said, okay, 16, no less. One time Prabhupada said, you have to think of Krishna. You have to be Krishna conscious, 100% Krishna conscious. Devotees were like morose. It was okay, 90%. Finally said 80% and no less, and like ended the lecture. He was trying to, we're not kidding around. We want to see Krishna. We want to embrace Krishna. That's our goal. We want to embrace God. It's no joke. And we're trying to make it as user-friendly and as doable as possible. But you still got to do a few things. You know, it's like the Jewish guy who needed some money, and so he kept praying and praying that he'd win the lottery. And he was just like every day going back to the synagogue and just praying like his life depended on it. And finally he heard a voice from the heavens call down to him. And it was like, hey, Chaim, buy a ticket? And so, you want to win a lottery, you got to buy a ticket. You want to embrace Krishna, we got to do something. We got to do something. We can want the grace, but we at least got to open the door for that grace to come in. And so don't get too freaked out. You can get married. For like huge swaths of the history of Hinduism, marriage wasn't an option. You join an ashram and that's it. That's like you're done. Lifelong vow of like the Catholic Church. Those guys are bummed. They like start at 21. They change their mind at like 25, you know? It's rough. They should make a rule. You can't take that vow until you're 32 or something like that. 35. Give a guy a chance, you know, to figure it out. We got a tradition. You can get married, you can have a family, but we don't fool around. We don't take drugs. We don't fool around. We're chaste. It sounds like some sort of Victorian ideal, but it's not. It's how you enable yourself to think about Krishna and chant your rounds in a deep way for a sustainable period of time. Otherwise, if you're like bombarding your senses and you're being a materialist, you won't be able to have the resolute determination to practice Krishna consciousness as a permanent feature of your life. And you'll end up bouncing back and forth. So we follow these rules, and Krishna still sent you somebody. He still sent you somebody. You still got what you wanted. You're going to get exactly what you want. You're going to get a family, get everything you want. You get to stay in Southern California, you get everything you wanted because you followed. Stay the course. Be a hero. It's still a much easier system. You follow? It's still streamlined. It's still essentialized. All the chafe has been removed. It's just the core. But it's still something. It's no joke. All right. We're all done. Thank you so very much, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Hopefully we'll see you again tomorrow. Hare Krishna.